I worked for my stepdad's business without earning a dime, and he took my mom and his kids on vacation, leaving me to do all the work, and told me I was nothing but an errand boy in his eyes, so I better act like one. When they came back a week later, I ordered stepdad to take his business out of my house, and he exploded when I told him about this visitor I had while he was away, and now I'm being called self-centered? Growing up in a blended family isn't always easy, but my experience wasn't about adjusting to step-siblings or dealing with new house rules. It was about surviving a situation where I was treated less like family and more like free labor. My mom married my stepdad, Greg, when I was 16. At first, it seemed like he was bringing stability into our lives. He had a small electrical contracting business, seemed reliable, and had 2 kids of his own, but within months it became clear that stability came with strings attached. Mainly my unpaid labor. At first, it really didn't seem like a big deal. Greg approached it in this casual, almost friendly way. Like, "Hey, do you mind giving me a hand this weekend? Just some small stuff, cleaning up the tools or organizing supplies in the truck." Didn't feel unreasonable. He was part of the family now, and I figured helping him out would make things easier for my mom. Plus, back then I didn't think much about saying no. He wasn't asking for anything major, so I didn't see the harm in helping out for a couple of hours on a Saturday. But of course it didn't stop there. The requests started coming more often. It wasn't just one Saturday here and there, it became every weekend. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary, like maybe he just needed help getting the business organized or catching up on work. But it didn't end after a few weeks or even a few months, and the tasks started getting more involved. "Can you sort these wires?" turned into, "Can you set up this equipment?" And before I knew it, I was doing stuff I'd never even thought I'd have to learn. It wasn't just organizing supplies anymore. It was crawling through hot, cramped attics to run wiring, hauling heavy equipment in and out of his truck, and even assisting him on actual jobs. The helping out that started so small had ballooned into full-blown work. School breaks were the next thing to go when other kids were planning trips, hanging out with friends, or just sleeping in. I was waking up early to put on work clothes and head out to whatever job Greg had lined up that day. Summer vacation? Forget it. While my friends were out doing normal teenage stuff, I was out in the sweltering heat, standing on ladders, pulling cables, or troubleshooting electrical issues alongside Greg. By the time I turned 17, it felt like every moment I wasn't in school belonged to Greg's business. My weekends, my summers, and even small breaks like Thanksgiving or spring vacation were fair game. He made it sound like it was just part of being in a family. "You're learning a skill," he'd say, or "this is good experience for you." And at the time, I bought into it because I didn't know any better. I didn't realize how wrong it was to expect that much from me, let alone without any kind of compensation or acknowledgement. It didn't help that my mom seemed torn about the whole thing. She'd occasionally say things like, "Don't overwork him, Greg," but it never felt like she was really backing me up. Maybe she didn't want to rock the boat, or maybe she thought Greg's arguments about learning a trade made sense. Either way, she didn't step in, and I didn't feel like I could push back without causing a huge fight. I remember one particularly exhausting summer. Temperatures were soaring, and I spent days working on outdoor electrical installations in the heat while Greg supervised. My friends invited me to a lake trip, but Greg shut it down immediately, saying I had responsibility. That became his favorite word when I ever mentioned having a social life or even just taking a break. What stung even more was the blatant unfairness. Greg's kids, both younger than me, were never asked to lift a finger. While I was sweating and getting covered in insulation dust, they were either out with friends or playing video games in the air-conditioned living room. When I asked why they didn't have to help, Greg snapped that they were too young or that it wasn't their place. Meanwhile, I was handling actual electrical repairs that I wasn't even properly trained for. Then there was the issue of money or lack of it. From all the hours I put in, Greg never paid me a cent. He'd say things like, "This is a family business and family pulls together, or you're learning a trade, you'll thank me later." Except I wasn't learning under some formal apprenticeship, I was just doing the grunt work. Anytime I brought it up with my mom, she'd either deflect or tell me to just keep the peace. She hated confrontation and would do anything to avoid rocking the boat, even if it meant turning a blind eye to how unfairly I was being treated. By the time I turned 19, I was fed up. I was juggling community college classes and working for Greg full-time without pay. My grades were slipping, I had no social life, and I didn't even have money to save up for my own independence. But the breaking point came last summer. Greg announced a family vacation, a week-long trip to Florida. My mom, Greg, and his kids were all going. I wasn't invited. When I asked why, Greg told me point blank that someone needed to hold down the fort and keep the business running. I couldn't believe it. While they lounged on the beach, I'd be stuck managing client calls, completing jobs, and handling everything else. His final words before they left stuck with me. "You are nothing but an errand boy, so you better act like one." I don't know what angered me more, the insult or the fact that he genuinely believed it. When they left, I decided I wasn't going to take it anymore. I didn't touch his list of jobs. Instead, I started packing up all his tools, equipment, and business supplies from the garage. I stacked everything neatly in one corner and made it clear I wasn't going to keep running things. While I was doing that, a visitor came to the house, a county inspector. Apparently Greg had been operating his business illegally out of our residential property. I had no idea, but someone must have reported him. The inspector gave me a warning notice for Greg and told me the business needed to relocate immediately. I could have ignored it and let Greg deal with it when he got back, but something about that moment gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt before. When they returned from their vacation, I handed Greg the notice and told him he had 2 weeks to move his business out of the house. At first, he left, thinking I wasn't serious, but when I didn't back down, his tone changed. He started yelling, accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish. The argument escalated quickly and he blamed me for everything: his business struggles, the inspector's visit, and even the strained family dynamics. My mom tried to mediate, but Greg's anger only made things worse. He said I was tearing the family apart and I should be ashamed of myself for not stepping up, but I didn't budge. I told him I wasn't going to be his errand boy anymore and that he needed to find a proper office for his business. The fallout was worse than I expected. Greg refused to speak to me for days, and his kids started calling me self-centered every chance they got. My mom begged me to reconsider, saying Greg was under a lot of stress and that I should try to understand his perspective. But what about my perspective? What about the years I spent working for free while everyone else got to enjoy their lives? I don't regret standing up for myself, but I can't help but wonder if I could have handled it differently. Should I have confronted Greg sooner? Should I have demanded payment or stopped working the moment things felt unfair? Now the house is tense. I feel like an outsider in my own home. Did I do the right thing or did I just make things worse for everyone? It's been a few days since the big blow-up with Greg and things around the house are still as tense as ever. Feels like everyone's walking on eggshells. Well, except for Greg. He's been stomping around muttering under his breath about family loyalty and how I've apparently betrayed him. He hasn't directly confronted me again though. I think even he knows there's not much more to say after the way I stood my ground. My mom, bless her heart, has been trying to play peacemaker, but honestly, it's just making things worse. She keeps saying things like, "We're all family, we need to work this out together." But her version of working things out is me backing down and apologizing, which isn't going to happen. She's been guilt-tripping me a bit too, reminding me how much Greg has done for us over the years and how hard he works. I know she's in a tough spot, but it's hard not to feel resentful when she doesn't fully acknowledge how much I've been taken advantage of. Meanwhile, Greg has started packing up his equipment. I thought this would be satisfying, like some kind of victory, but it's honestly just awkward, watching him load up tools and extension cords into his truck while muttering about how kids these days don't understand hard work feels surreal. Every now and then he'll slam something down extra hard just to make a point. I tried to stay out of his way because I'm not interested in another argument, but the tension is thick enough to cut with a knife. The most surprising part of all this, that big client I mentioned, the one who came by while Greg was on vacation, has actually turned out to be a game changer. During that week, I put together a detailed proposal for the project even though I didn't know if Greg would follow through. It's a big commercial job, way more complex than the typical residential stuff he usually does. I spent hours researching the specific, figuring out the material, and estimating labor costs. I even went so far as to outline a timeline and list potential subcontractors we'd need to bring on. At the time, I did it more out of a sense of responsibility than anything else. I figured if I didn't, Greg would blow the opportunity, and I wasn't about to let that happen on my watch. Apparently, the client was really impressed. I got a call from them yesterday asking some follow-up questions about the proposal. They specifically mentioned how professional and thorough everything was, which caught me off guard. I guess I've been so used to being dismissed by Greg that I didn't realize I might actually be good at this stuff. The client even asked if I'd be the main point of contact for the project, which made me laugh a little because I'm technically not even part of Greg's business. I explained the situation as politely as I could, and they seemed a bit taken aback. I told them Greg would be handling things moving forward, but I have a feeling they're less confident in him now than they were before. When I told Greg about the client's feedback, he didn't seem happy at all. I thought maybe he'd at least acknowledge that I'd done a good job, but instead, he brushed it off like it was no big deal. He said something along the lines of, "Well, it's my business, so of course they were impressed. You were just doing what you were supposed to do." It was infuriating, but not surprising. That's Greg in a nutshell, never giving credit where it's due. I've been spending a lot of time in my room partly to avoid Greg, but also because I need space to think. This whole situation has me questioning so many things, like why I let it go on for so long and why my mom didn't step in sooner. It's hard not to feel bitter about it, I gave up so much of my time and energy for that business, and for what? To be called an errand boy and treated like I'm disposable? At the same time, I'm trying to look at the positives. For one thing, I've realized that I'm actually pretty capable. The fact that the client was so impressed with my work feels like validation even if Greg doesn't see it that way. It's also made me think about what I want for my future. I don't want to spend the rest of my life working under someone who doesn't respect me, whether it's Greg or anyone else. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next. Greg hasn't officially moved everything out yet, and I'm not sure where he's planning to relocate his business. My mom keeps saying we need to find a compromise, but I honestly don't know what that would even look like. I've already compromised enough over the years, and I'm done bending over backward to keep the peace. If Greg wants to treat me like an employee, then he needs to act like a boss, starting with paying me what I'm owed. I've been trying to keep myself busy in the meantime. I picked up a few extra shifts at my part-time job, partly to get out of the house and partly because I need to start saving up. The thought of moving out has been on my mind more and more lately. I love my mom, but living under the same roof as Greg feels unbearable right now. If things don't change soon, I think I'll have to start seriously looking for my own place. Still, there's a part of me that feels guilty. Maybe it's because my mom keeps telling me how stressed Greg is, or maybe it's because I've always been the kind of person who avoids conflict. I can't help but wonder if I could have handled things differently. Maybe I should have spoken up sooner instead of letting everything build up to this point. Maybe I should have tried harder to negotiate with Greg instead of dropping everything on him all at once. But then I think about all the times I tried to speak up and got shut down. Every time I asked for a break or brought up the idea of getting paid, Greg would dismiss me or make me feel like I was being selfish. At a certain point, you just get tired of fighting the same battle over and over again. For now, I'm just taking things one day at a time. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm not going back to being Greg's unpaid labor. If that makes me self-centered in his eyes, then so be it. I'd rather be self-centered than let someone take advantage of me any longer. Hi. Few days after the whole blow-up with Greg, I realized that venting my frustrations wasn't going to be enough. I'd taken a stand, sure, but now I needed to figure out where to go from here. The truth is, I wasn't just angry. I felt cheated. I poured years of work into his business for nothing, and no one seemed to think that was a problem except me. It wasn't just the money, though that was a big part of it. It was the principle. I was tired of feeling like my time and effort didn't matter, so I decided to do some research. I spent hours on Google trying to figure out if there was any way to hold Greg accountable for all the unpaid labor. I came across articles and forums about workplace exploitation, and it hit me that my situation wasn't that different from what some people experience in toxic work environments. The only twist was that this was happening in my own home with someone who was supposed to be family. Eventually, I came across a few resources about employment laws in my state, and the more I read, the more I realized I might have a case. The key was whether my work for Greg could be considered professional-level labor, which it definitely was. I wasn't just sweeping floors or organizing tools. I was doing actual electrical installations, handling client communications, and even managing proposals. Those aren't things you can just brush off as chores. I decided to take it a step further and reach out to a lawyer. I found a local employment law professional who specialized in cases like mine where the lines between family and work get blurred. The plus point is that he is my old friend's dad. Honestly, I was nervous about reaching out. I wasn't sure if he'd even take me seriously, but he was super understanding. They listened to everything: how it started with weekend help and escalated into full-time work without pay, how Greg dismissed any attempt I made to talk about compensation, and how my mom stayed neutral through it all. The lawyer explained a few things that really stuck with me. First, unpaid labor is illegal when it involves professional-level tasks, especially over an extended period, even though Greg's business was technically a family operation that didn't exempt him from the law. Second, there's a concept called retroactive wage claims, which basically means I could potentially demand back pay for all the work I did. Of course, it wasn't as simple as just filing a claim. The lawyer warned me that the family dynamic could complicate things and that pursuing legal action might create even more tension at home, but just knowing I had options made me feel a little more in control. While I was dealing with all this, Greg was busy trying to get his business up and running from a new location. He found a small commercial space to rent, which honestly felt like a win for me. For years, he'd used our home as his personal office and warehouse, taking up space and disrupting our lives without a second thought. Now he was finally forced to operate like a real business owner, but things weren't going as smoothly for Greg as I think he'd hoped. That big commercial project I'd set up during his vacation was moving forward, but without my direct involvement, it was clear he was struggling to keep up. I heard him on the phone a few times trying to answer the client's questions, and it was obvious he didn't know the details as well as I did. The client even called me once asking if I could clarify something about the proposal. I redirected them to Greg, of course, but it felt bittersweet. On one hand, I was proud that my work had been good enough to impress a big client. On the other hand, it was frustrating to see Greg flounder when I knew I could have handled it so much better. The situation with Greg's business wasn't just affecting him though. The tension at home was worse than ever. My mom was still stuck in the middle trying to keep the peace, but it was clear she was starting to crack under the pressure. She kept saying things like, "Can't you two just sit down and talk it out?" Or "This isn't good for the family." But what she didn't seem to understand was that this wasn't just about me and Greg not getting along. It was about years of unfair treatment that had finally come to a head. Meanwhile, Greg wasn't making things any easier. He started acting like the victim, going on about how he was doing his best and how I was making his life harder. It was almost laughable considering how much easier I'd made his life for years. At one point, he even hinted that I'd sabotaged his business by kicking him out of the house, which couldn't have been further from the truth. If anything, I'd kept his business afloat while he was off on vacation. As all this was unfolding, I kept going back and forth in my head about whether to pursue legal action. On one hand, I wanted justice. I wanted Greg to acknowledge everything I'd done for his business and to make things right. But on the other hand, I worried about what it would do to my family. Would my mom ever forgive me if I took things that far? Would Greg retaliate somehow? It was a lot to think about and I didn't want to rush into anything without weighing all the pros and cons. In the meantime, I decided to focus on myself for once. I started looking into technical programs at local colleges, thinking maybe I could turn all those years of unpaid labor into something positive. I realized that despite everything, I'd gained a lot of valuable skills working for Greg. I knew how to run electrical wiring, troubleshoot systems, and even handle client relations. Those aren't things you learn in a classroom, and I figured I might as well put them to good use. But even as I tried to move forward, the situation with Greg kept nagging at me. Part of me wanted to let it go, to just move on and leave the past behind, but another part of me felt like letting it go would mean letting Greg off the hook, and that didn't sit right with me. After everything I'd been through, I felt like I deserved some kind of closure, whether that came in the form of an apology, compensation, or just a simple acknowledgement of what I'd done for him. As of now, I haven't made any final decisions about the legal route. I'm still weighing my options and trying to figure out what's best for me in the long run, but one thing I do know is that I'm done being a doormat. Greg might see me as a self-centered or ungrateful, but I see myself as someone who finally decided to stand up for what's right. And, honestly, I think that's something to be proud of. Hello, all. It's been about 2 weeks since I started really thinking about my options and where to go from here. Honestly, things didn't unfold in some dramatic explosive way like you'd expect in a movie. Instead, it was more like a series of small, quiet moments that finally led to some resolution. Greg, of all people, surprised me the most. After weeks of tension and standoffs and passive-aggressive muttering, he seemed to take a step back and reevaluate. I think a few things finally clicked for him. For one, I made it clear that I wasn't bluffing when I said I was done being taken advantage of. And two, I think he started to realize how precarious his situation really was. Between the stress of running his business from a new location, the challenges with the big commercial project, and the potential legal implications of the unpaid labor, I think he finally saw that digging in his heels wasn't going to help him. It didn't happen all at once, but Greg started to soften. Instead of making snide remarks about family loyalty, he started talking about how we could move forward and put this behind us. At first, I was skeptical. Was this just another way for him to manipulate the situation? But as we talked more, it felt different. He seemed genuinely worried about the potential consequences of legal advice I'd gotten. I think that fear forced him to take me seriously for the first time. Eventually, we sat down, just me, Greg, and my mom, and hashed things out. It wasn't easy, definitely wasn't quick. There were a lot of awkward pauses, a lot of circling back to the same points, and even a few moments where I thought we might start yelling at each other again. But in the end, we managed to come up with something that felt fair. The agreement we reached was pretty straightforward. First, Greg would compensate me for a portion of the work I'd done over the years. It wasn't the full amount I felt I was owed, but it was enough to feel like a meaningful acknowledgement of my contributions. Second, he agreed to formally recognize the work I'd done on his business behalf. He even offered to write me a letter of recommendation, which I could use if I ever wanted to work in the electrical field. Lastly, and this was the most important part, we agreed to set clear boundaries between family relationships and professional expectations. No more family duty excuses to justify unpaid labor. If Greg ever wanted my help in the future, it would be on my terms with proper pay and clear expectations. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it felt like a step in the right direction. For the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over my life. I wasn't just an errand boy anymore. I was someone whose time, skills, and effort were finally being recognized. Around the same time, I decided to take another big step for myself. I enrolled in a local technical college. It felt like the logical next move, considering all the experience I'd gained working for Greg. Despite everything, I couldn't deny that those years of unpaid labor had given me a solid foundation in electrical work. I figured if I could turn that into a proper certification. I figured if I could turn that into a proper certification or degree, I could open up a lot of doors for myself, whether that meant starting my own business someday or working for a company that actually values its employees. The first day of classes was nerve-wracking, but in a good way. It felt strange to be back in a classroom setting after so many years of learning on the job, but it was also exciting. I could finally see a future for myself that wasn't tied to Greg's business or his expectations. For the first time, I was building something that was entirely mine. At home, things were still a little awkward, but they're getting better. Greg seems to be trying to make amends in his own way. He's not exactly the type to apologize outright, but he's been less combative and more willing to listen, which feels like progress. My mom, on the other hand, is just relieved that we found some kind of resolution. She's still walking on eggshells a bit, but I can tell she's trying to be more supportive of me now. The big commercial project Greg was working on is still in progress, and from what I've heard, it's been a bit of a struggle for him. I think he's finally realizing just how much I was doing behind the scenes. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little vindicated, but I'm not holding a grudge about it. If anything, I hope it's a wake-up call for him to start treating people better, whether it's me, his future employees, or even his own kids. Looking back on everything, I've learned a lot, not just about electrical work, but about myself and what I'm willing to tolerate. I used to think that standing up for myself would make me seem selfish or ungrateful, but now I realize that it's the opposite. Recognizing your worth and setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. If I hadn't taken that stand, I'd probably still be stuck in the same cycle working myself to the bone for someone who didn't appreciate me. I don't know what the future holds, but I feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. I'm excited to see where my technical training takes me, and I'm even thinking about exploring other interests I never had time for before. For so long, my life revolved around Greg's business and his expectations, but now it feels like I'm finally living for myself. This whole experience has taught me that family dynamics can be messy and complicated, but they don't have to define you. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they have the right to exploit you or take you for granted. At the end of the day, it's okay to stand up for yourself, even if it upsets the people around you, because if you don't, who will? So that's where things stand now.